I don't know if you want to add to this point, but yeah, okay.
Yeah, I would again like to go back, and I completely agree with both of them that if you look at it historically, it probably started out of the time of the World War, at least in the developing countries. Again, it started off because of shortages of various commodities. You had industrial production which was on the decline, so subsidized electricity was provided, subsidized gasoline was provided primarily to ensure that there was access. And again, that time India was under the British rule, so I'm not saying that whatever came, it started off with the British. Okay, British rule. That's when the subsidies actually was introduced. Now, the point that it is being continued despite the fact that the situation varies from country to country. A lot of developing countries, it's primarily the lack of political will, the lack of it's more in terms of changing to something new. The fear of changing from something to something new because of the fear of losing the vote bank politics. It's basically they think most governments, most political parties think that if they say no subsidies for energy, then people will not vote for them. Okay. Now, if you look at it historically, the political parties which has actually increased the price of gasoline just before elections have actually lost elections. If you look at it, many countries, okay, it's not just in India. You look at most countries, election period. So before election period, normally, if you know that next year's election, you know that this year there's going to be no price increase of gasoline. Historically, that's been the trend in many countries. I'm not saying it's the trend in all countries, right? Now, there again, there are two reasons. I think in terms of campaign, at least in developing countries, it's not reached that level of maturity where people can, where civil society groups can actually started to educate people that these subsidies are actually not reaching them, and for example, if you were to do a very simple campaign, which is something that we started very, very recently, if you do a simple campaign that, diesel, there's a lot of protest when there's a price of, increase the price of diesel. But actually, if you were to have dual pricing, or if you have to have some mechanism which can control the price of diesel, the price of diesel need not increase for transporters and truckers and others, which means that there's no increase in price of essential commodities like food and all that. That kind of argument with numbers is still not being made. So what happens is politicians are very happy to say, okay, we'll roll back the price of diesel, don't touch it and so on. That kind of numbers, that kind of research, that kind of thing is still not gone into. I think that's where we need to do a lot more focus, at least in developing countries. If you look at in terms of campaign strategy, because you're looking at campaign strategy, I think some of the tools that you need to look into, fossil fuel subsidies, how do you bring the consumer angle to it? Okay, removing subsidies does not necessarily increase the price of commodities. Okay, if you can make that argument by showing how subsidies are being spent, I think that's the beginning.
Yes,
there's transparency, what you said. Huh?
I want to add to what Srini just said, because I believe two reasons why we still have the unsustainable subsidies are fear at the top level, politics, and also fear at the bottom level, population. And then it's a lack of information on both levels as well. The population doesn't really know what getting rid of subsidies means to them, and then the politics don't know how the population will actually react to increasing food prices and other commodities. So I believe I work on the renewable energy transition in MENA countries, especially of North Africa, and last year beginning of the revolutions in Tunisia and Egypt and Algeria and also other countries, energy prices, especially on oil, have risen to a new height. And because energy prices are very much correlated to food prices, and those countries are especially import dependent on energy and food and water, and the politicians couldn't really cope with the rising prices. One of the triggers for the revolution were these rising prices. So the politicians in those countries fear that once the prices rise for special commodities like water and food and energy, revolution will start again and protests will come up. So what we need is campaigns who evaluate the perception of the population and also give guidance to the politics how to reduce the unsustainable subsidies so that the population will benefit from reductions to decrease the fear on both sides. And one key term that we really need to change, in which I heard a couple of times today, is the wording of security. Because security, water security, energy security, food security is an illusion. Because it keeps those countries who import goods in a development trap. What we need to achieve is sovereignty. And if we achieve food security or energy security by importing goods, that doesn't help the countries to develop. It might keep them food secure and feed their stomachs, but it won't help the development in those countries. So we really need to get rid of the subsidies to achieve sovereignty in those key issues: energy, food, and water.
So what does this mean? Because does this mean that you should have a shift of the subsidies away from the oil and maybe also from the bread or food to alternatives? The oil is clear, it's the renewable energy. But concerning the food,
yes,
it might be difficult. What is the alternative there? It's not so easy. Because you need something to eat.
Yes, we need something to eat, of course. But maybe there are some studies in MENA countries, in Jordan and Morocco, who found out that getting rid of subsidies on food isn't perceived by the population as a threat to their security. They can still feed their children, but those higher prices have to be balanced in other fields, like health and education and so on. So I would add.
Okay, I think from my perspective, this discussion about good subsidy, or let's say getting rid of subsidies is the only alternative to bad subsidies is not the right discussion from my perspective, because especially in the agriculture sector, I mean, we definitely need to discuss that more comprehensively, because I mean, whenever I would always say okay, let's always check and monitor how a subsidy really supports the public interest and a common interest, let's say. And let's somehow reinvent as well how to subsidize certain public goods and public interest we are interested in. Because you mentioned it very much in the beginning when you said, oh, what we need is that the price, we need prices, real prices, or you said something like that.
Mentioned there was a statement from his presentation.
Yeah, something like that. And
internalization of the
all this internalization debate, and I think that's from my perspective that doesn't reach far enough. But we'll always have certain things we want as a society, which we can definitely not express by prices, and we probably always need subsidies to push certain processes, and I'm very much in favor for food subsidies in certain extent. But we need a monitoring mechanism when and how to fade them out as soon as they are not helpful from a public interest perspective anymore, or from a vulnerability perspective. I mean, this is always one very important point from my perspective, that you really have this human rights perspective and who profits, who's maybe worse off because of a certain political measure as well.
But they are good and bad subsidies, when you mention it. In the nutrition sector, it's okay.
I mean, I said it's not helpful to have a bad,
but
to have a
differentiate.
I mean, there are definitely good subsidies in the food and agriculture sector, but there are terrible subsidies as well. So
it's the same in the energy sector.
And it's just that we definitely need a differentiated debate. And the interesting question from my point is, how do we develop a monitoring mechanism? How we can somehow fade out
and
subsidies?
how can we incorporate this in the legislation?
Yeah, exactly.
I think the next one was, but we are focusing on the unsustainable ones.
That's it.
I think, who was the next one? Srini?
See, I would agree with you, I'd say, and I would also add to it. It's not about is subsidies required or not. It's about good versus bad subsidies. And I think even there, I would also add another point. It's about necessary subsidies and not necessary subsidies, or something that can, where you have alternatives. Okay. Now, for example, while you generally, most civil society groups are calling for a phase out of fossil fuel subsidies, right? Now, I would say that in lots of developing countries, it's not going to be that easy. It's not going to be possible at all, right? It's not. I'm not, again there. If you say if we ban all fossil fuel subsidies as bad subsidies, then it becomes a little dangerous for the sole reason that the price of diesel for truckers cannot. It will take some time for it to be increased. Now, diesel is also perceived, or kerosene to that extent is also perceived as a fuel for agricultural pump sets. And with countries where you have 60–70% of the population dependent on agriculture for their livelihood, okay, that would be, if increasing the price or removing the subsidies which would lead to increase the price would be difficult. But what could then happen is in a phased manner, if you can bring in subsidies for, let's say, solar water pumping systems. You know, you have more pilots which can show people that this works better than that. That's the kind of beginning that one needs to take. So I would say that yes, there are certain some amount of food subsidies that definitely require subsidies. So it's not the question. The debate is not about should we phase out all subsidies. The question is what is unsustainable and what is sustainable. I think that's the important part. What is required in the short run? What can go out in the medium run? What can go out in the long run? I think that's the kind of distinction that needs to be made.
Yeah. So also a question of definition. Who was next? I think it was.
I think I'm waiting for
Okay.
them.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, sorry, I lost you.
No, it's okay. I just wanted to add in terms of the causes, or like the identification of reasons for continued existence. I think that there is this kind of dependency path that we have, because, for instance, in the agricultural sector, in relation to energy subsidies, in fact, the model of agriculture we have developed here is heavily dependent on cheap energy subsidies, not so much like in direct sense you explained, but in the indirect sense of having fertilizers, pesticides actually being made from cheap gas or cheap oil. And there have been a lot of basically investment into monocrop agriculture with heavy machinery that is also, of course, like a big, heavily dependent on cheap fuel, and the transition is actually very costly, and the cost of the transition is not known. So moving to something from this type of agriculture to something that would be agroecology, that will be actually be very cheap in terms of inputs and energy, basically sort of zero. Not being dependent on energy is somehow much easier for southern nation than for northern one, who have to actually completely say, okay, we invested into something that is not sustainable, and there has been also a lot of other subsidies that have been, helping into, taking advantage of the cheap energy. Mm-hmm. So that was one point, like this kind of problem of the side sector benefiting, and the development of the sector benefiting from cheap energy. And then I also wanted to nuance the kind of when subsidies do arise, because I think you said when it arises when there is no democratic somehow.
It's no transparency normally. No transparency.
Yeah, there is no transparency. But at the same time, for the agriculture, actually, there has been a lot of evolution in the type of subsidies. The common agriculture policy has been going from a system of basically, it's not really money that was put on the table. It was rather basically a safety net saying we have guaranteed price. So actually, not money that would really be so much like disbursed, to a system in '92 where we actually changed. And we said, okay, now we're going to have direct payments, and there is an evolution in terms of the subsidies. And in the first place, it was elected government saying, okay, we have to reach food security in Europe, and we are basically setting a system that will boost production, and a subsidy system that would enhance, help it. But then, at one point, it moved to another area that was triggering other unsustainable subsidies. So it was just nuancing.
So I would suggest final statements regarding the reasons, and then we would move on to the second part.
Maybe one other argument, it's obvious, that's the receiver of the subsidies especially in the agriculture sector, because there are not so many, they are accustomed to this huge amount of monies, and so they express their interest to the public that they can't exist any longer without the subsidies. And that's a big pressure, of course, towards the politicians, towards the public in general. So it's to be accustomed to these subsidies.
So, final statements regarding the first part?
Yeah.
So I think
Can I try one
we
maybe?
Yes.
That there is in general no unsustainable meant subsidy, but the problem is that we missed monitoring the outcome of the subsidy, and they become unsustainable over the time. And maybe to overcome this, we should, if we think about new subsidies, we should in parallel think about monitoring and controlling the outcomes of the subsidies, and incorporate in the politics a stop, something like a switch.
When we realize that they are become unsustainable,
Then
perhaps they were before.
this the outcome of the monitoring, and then there is an automatic stop.
Automatic stop, that would be nice.
There is something.
Perhaps we're already on a shift, maybe, but I think we couldn't focus on this question. What can be the first steps to address the hurdles? So it's mentioned, it's obvious that we have to remove them, but how can we start and where can we start? What are the first impulses? We want not look for the big solution, but our concrete first steps for progress.
Can I maybe add on to that then? I mean, it's probably not a realistic one that we're going to write on the board, that we as NGOs are going to focus on. But actually, I mean, I wanted to mention this before, actually, what we were discussing about subsidies and ending subsidies, that it's so impossible. It is actually true for every single piece of government policy. I come from a policy research background. It's more or less always the same thing. Ending a policy is almost impossible. You can change it, you can make it irrelevant. It's very rare for administrative processes. And that is also true for subsidies. And then it's also added on to that is the problem of interest groups that are growing with the subsidy. And there is actually experiment. I mean, this would be a very obvious concept. You just it's called sunset legislation. You just you pass a law and you say this law extinguishes itself after 10 years, and then you have to rerun. You would have theoretically to rerun the process to pass them. It's been tried in 1 or 2 cases somewhere, but I mean, this politically that is not really possible. But that is going into the direction. I mean, okay, I just wanted to mention this because this is actually there. This has been tried. This is kind of an idea, but it's more an idea of idealistic political scientists more than that it has been really tried in politics. But it is definitely going in the direction of strengthening monitoring systems. And I guess that is, I mean, that is very vague and that is very broad. But to overcome perverse subsidy systems, that is, it's more the question: how do we do that, and what can we contribute to that? But I guess that's definitely one direction.
Okay.
I mean, one pretty obvious and point probably is as well like this shaming and blaming and transparency points. Like, I mean, for the agriculture part, for example, is
farm subsidy.
Yeah, exactly. Like when who's actually the winner of the subsidy? Who's gaining from that? And like this, yeah, exactly. And for example, like it was German Watch, Oxfam, and some others who were in this transparent subsidies initiative over years. And I mean, everybody was so shocked when finally the EU really made farm subsidies visible per farm and per receiver, and then suddenly one could see that wow, there are like these huge farms who are getting thousands and thousands and thousands of euros per year, and I mean this is something like you're scandalizing just this quality, and I think this is one part of civil society strategies to scandalize perverse subsidies.
Who is it? Who is it really? When we think in both dimensions, first steps and which forum should we use to address the one who have an interest not to overcome the unsustainable subsidies? Who is it? Are these the farmers, the receivers? Are these
I mean, that depends probably very much on the kind of subsidy, but I would say from agricultural subsidies, it's definitely the big agriculture industry, the big producers, but as well like the yeah, exactly. I mean, yeah, and that might be very different for the energy subsidies and so on, but I think, yeah, sure, it's the receivers as well, and the industry behind it.
Yeah, but also the consumers, some of them are also interested, because there is I think, conflict of interests. And the interests of the old black carbon society and economy is still very powerful. How can we overcome their powerful influence on the politics? I think that is...
But to be honest, from the agriculture perspective, to find a European consumer who says, oh yeah, it's a really great idea to really subsidize with half of the EU budget our agriculture sector. I think that's really, I mean, from a consumer side, that's really hard to find. Here it's really, I think it's the interest groups. And I think, I mean, I would never say we have to get rid of our whole agricultural subsidies. I think we definitely need them to restructure the sector. We just need different ones. But I think here it's not necessarily the consumers group, it's really the receivers.
Okay, but at the end of the chain, are not also the consumers interested in low prices when we think of meat and something?
Yeah, they pay several times the, you know, it's true that food is in a way cheaper for them, but if we look at the picture behind, they actually are paying several times the food they eat, because they pay it when they are the cashier, but then they pay it through the direct payment, through the tax they pay to the state, who is in the EU budget for the common agriculture policy, actually feeding in the unsustainable agriculture. So they pay several times actually the bill of the food. So it would be rather in their interest not to be in favor of the subsidy, even though the price of food might be then higher. It's you know, money from the tax they paid will go somewhere else, and it would go actually in food voucher, especially for the poorest segment of the population, to actually enable them to cope with the higher prices.
I think that brings the whole question of how is the process of subsidies, which are actually, you know, how is the process of dispersing the subsidies? Right now what happens is the subsidy goes directly to the oil companies, or it goes directly to the large manufacturers, right? So as she said very rightly, you know, what happens is because of that, there might be a small reduction in the price of food or price of something, but then that subsidy, where is the government getting the subsidy from? It's anyway coming by way of taxes, right? Now, if they were to, instead of going there, if that money could actually come in the form of vouchers, if you can prove that you really need that, or in some such form. Okay, now that's being tried in India now. So basically what will happen is there will be a market price for kerosene, there will be a market price for diesel, everything will be market price. And then you will have a card which will show that if you are below a certain level, what we call the poverty line, then you get a card and then you go there, and every month, whatever you consume, there's a bill, and then that gets into your bank account. So what happens is no money goes towards the oil companies or any of them. So it goes to the people. So then you can actually then rationalize as to how the subsidy is being. But it still does not address the question of is that subsidy required or not. It only addresses the issue of ensuring that the subsidy is not being wasted or it gets targeted. But then the question again still comes, I think some sort of an automatic thing saying that okay, from now on no more kerosene subsidy for some automatic mechanism or something like that, that needs to be put in place. This will not address that issue.
I want to raise another basic point, because we should also try to describe some demands what we have. I think it's fundamental that every subsidy should be time bounded. That means should be fixed up to, let's say, 1, 2, 3 years, and after this time there should be automatically revision about effects. for every subsidy, because also, for example, we spoke a lot of the agriculture sector in Europe because it's 40% of the budget. We have only estimations at the moment how much percentage of these agriculture are harmful towards the biodiversity. We have know several studies showing about 75% are harmful towards the biodiversity and only 7% are environmental friendly. At the moment, but we don't know exactly. And now we have the meeting in Hyderabad, COP11 CBD, and there was the Commissioner Potočnik, and we had an NGO meeting with him. And he, because we are very much demanding this change of harmful subsidies for biodiversity in the agriculture sector, and he promised that's very important for the future for us in Europe, maybe in other parts of the world too, that he wants to establish a system for the 27 member states to describe at national basis, in every case, in which amount there are the harmful subsidies towards the biodiversity. So that's a start to define them. Otherwise, we spoke always the same, you have to reduce, you have to change, and no one knows exactly what the harmful subsidies are concerning the agriculture and biodiversity sector. And we have a goal, within CBD there are 20 strategic goals decided in the last COP, and one goal is to phase out or at least to reduce or switch the harmful subsidies towards biodiversity. So it's a international defined goal up to 2020. It's some years ago. But no one starts up to now. Therefore it's so important that European Union obviously now starts to define them, because it's the first step.
Yeah.
And this time bound is important to fix them. Every subsidy should be fixed. It's a basic point because it's a market position, of course.
That's true. But so there was mentioned that there is a lack of information. It's also a question of information, and if we all agree that there we are on the run, perhaps we can contribute with all our knowledge, then we will have the move. We will have time-bounded regulations, so we can prove our own subsidies in certain times. But I want to insist that there is still a conflict of interests. So there are still some pressure groups who are really interested to have them. And I think we have to face them. That's not only a historical question that we can overcome into the next 10, 20 years. There are hard interests also in the aviation sector. There, perhaps, I think, are also the consumers very interested to have this cheap flight ticket. So I think we have also to think about the people on the street who have an interest to have this small consumer prices, when they go to the supermarket and want to buy something. They don't think in such complex circumstances and frameworks. We have to consider that also they have to support this idea and how we can address them. By campaigning. Are they really willing to support us when we say, okay, at the end of the day, you will buy for much more than this? Yeah, Linda?
Sorry, I didn't introduce myself before. I'm Linda Grieshaber from Germanwatch. I think one way to get the consumers on board is actually to show them what the external costs are. So what are the other costs that we are not paying right now? And to show them then the difference. And I mean, it's still difficult probably to convince them to pay the more expensive air ticket, but it's a way of showing them that there are other costs associated if we don't pay higher costs.
But it still is like when you pay air ticket or something, how much external cost is behind and how much it can affect me really. Then you decide. It's your personal benefit when you talk about these small things. So when you find that these small things, the whole time I'm going like my country or my whole economy is losing something, but for myself, still I'm benefited. So it doesn't affect anything.
I get my cheap Ryanair flight, regardless if there is externalization or not.
So like, it's like, for me, I understand it, like, somehow we want to avoid that kind of clash, but what we need to pressurize that corporate groups, those who always want to make like like without limit benefit. They want to make more money. We don't want to make them anything. We don't want to hurt them or something like that. And we are coming back to encourage consumers or things like that. That for me is like long process. Then the other one is maybe the shorter one.
That's true. But yeah, who can we address first? That's what I want to focus on. Who is it? Is it the legislation? Is it the people on the street? What are the alliances we need for this support, for this progress? So I want to focus on these points. I know we can't find the big solution, the big bang, but perhaps to focus on the first steps. Yeah.
See, I think in my view, the consumers need to be educated. Whether you look at the airlines or whether you look at any, who actually benefits. I'm not very sure that the passengers are actually benefited, or what happens is that there's a reduction in, if there's no VAT for kerosene, or if there's a subsidized kerosene, it's actually benefiting the airline operator.
Yeah.
Okay. Now he is not going to reduce his profit margin. His profit margin, whatever his operational cost, whatever he spends, he'll continue to spend. Right? He is not bringing in energy efficiency in his operation to keep the cost low. So whatever reduction in thing is actually benefiting him. As far as the consumer is concerned, one is if there were to be, if these people were to be more conscious, there are other ways to keep the cost low for the consumers, right? Now, for the consumer, what happens is because of that subsidies going there, subsidy which is required for something which is more useful, which is more important from a common man's perspective, is actually ignored. It's actually a thing. If you look at some of these in a lot of countries in Africa, the amount of money actually spent for education is much lesser. If you look at budgetary thing, it's much lesser than how much money is being spent for these kind of subsidies. So the consumer, I think, need to be educated, and so I would say that right now the general perception is consumers are against subsidy removal. Yes, they may be against it because they are not aware of the facts. Okay, if you can actually bring them, make them aware of the facts as to how in the medium run they are actually being affected and not being benefited, I think that would be a good starting point.
Okay. So, who's first? Ladies first.
In the working group where I was before with this best practices model, there was someone from Africa and talking about as well about the subsidies the African governments are giving, like subsidizing fertilizer for the agricultural sector. And he said, if one would express the subsidies given for like 50 kilos of fertilizer by the government in money or in chicken or pigs, which could have given to the farmer instead. That would really be a wake-up call for everybody, because you just throw the fertilizer on your field, it destroys your soil structure and everything, and then it's gone. And instead you could have, by all the subsidies going into the fertilizer, you could have gotten a cow who produces the fertilizer for years and years. So that was pretty nice, just as an example how necessary it is to translate this abstract, huge figures, like for those who finally think they are benefiting, or in the end to really make clear, there are other ways you would benefit much more if this money would have been invested, in a different way.
Mm-hmm. So it is the last round.
Yes, as Srini said, I believe education is important, of course, and then as well we need surveys that evaluate the perception of the educated people on subsidies. Because only through surveys and evaluation of perceptions and opinions we can translate the education into policy actions. And we need to participatory evaluate what measures should be in place to compensate and balance the fossil subsidies, for example, or unsustainable subsidies to promote sustainable development for rural communities and overcome poverty and so on. So we need accompanied approaches that go hand in hand with information campaigns, education campaigns, public outreach, and surveys to translate it into policy actions and measures.
Yeah, I would emphasize this point of creating a vision that you are better off without this subsidy, for a very individual, out of a very individual perspective. I think we should look on this positive vision, because the negative one is very, let's say, time limited. You can say, you can blame someone, he's earning so much money and you don't earn so much money. This is what you can do once, maybe twice, and then it's not interesting for the one. But as you said, if we overcome this kind of subsidy, you get, instead of subsidized fertilizer, there's enough money, the amount is enough for giving you a cow. Yeah. Or maybe this can also work in the air travel sector. Yeah? If we find pictures and visions that the world is better off without this subsidy, this could be a very strong driver for people.
Okay.
Yeah, I think this is about convincing about the alternative, that the alternatives are existing and that they are worth getting the investment actually there. And that relates to what you said, that actually there are actually some studies or cases already in other parts of the world of, okay, it's not happening like this, it's happening differently, and it's working out. You know, so it's basically also spreading information about how alternatives are working out. And for instance, for the train and air ticket you had as an example, to say, okay, if we reduce, I mean, it would be interesting to know what would be the real price of my flight if I'm not, you know, if there is no more, you know, subsidies into the fuel, and also knowing, okay, is the railway sector benefiting from subsidy and from how much, and couldn't we redirect towards you know, renewable system of energy for the train instead, and you know. That I came by train from Prague. Very good. Yeah. It was not so much more expensive, in fact. Yeah. So it was cheaper.
It took how long?
It was long. It was almost 12 hours, but
how long?
Almost 12, but
12 hours.
overnight.
Okay.
So final statement.
I think it is also very important for us as NGO to support initiatives with the aim to reach political agreement in concerning harmful subsidies. Two examples. One is the so-called roadmap of the European Union to phase out or at least reduce the harmful subsidies. And this was done overcoming the pressure mainly from the European Parliament and the NGOs. And in the meantime, it was postponed because you know, it's highly political to reduce these. But it's necessary to have such a political instrument. And the other example is what I already mentioned: is international agreement at the CBD, at the Convention of Biological Diversity, because this is valid worldwide, and we can use it for our work in the NGO. We can say, okay, there was a decision at the international level. It's not binding, of course, because there are no sanctions, but nevertheless it's existing, and the governments have decided honestly without a rejection, and so it's valid, and we can use it for our work. So this is very important to have such international flags anyway.
I agree with basically everything. That's one thing I want to say. I want to add one thing. I mean, to the monitoring and the NGOs have to increase transparency. Yes, I think. I mean, there was once an argument in the room between positive arguments and negative arguments. I think that's very different from. I think we can be flexible in that way. It's very different from subsidy to subsidy. In some, the potential is so good to scandalize it. It's just absurd. And sometimes, of course, it's socially very difficult. There's really very difficult questions associated with how it affects small, poor people, etc. And there, it's transparency is always. I mean, usually subsidies, except for blatant examples, are very, very complicated. Nobody really knows. So I think we have a lot of work that we can do to put it in good images, good pictures, pictures that are easily understandable. And there's one thing I would like to add, what we haven't discussed yet, was well, I think it appeared once. It was kind of how do we manage the opposition, the strong interests that are vested in industries that have been gaining from subsidies over years. I think it's, and that's also different from subsidy to subsidy. I think it's very interesting to look exactly at the structure and see if there's. Usually, it seems like you're confronted with a monolithic block when you oppose industry. Usually in Germany, it's always the industry association, it's always the BDI. But then if you look a little bit behind it, I mean, most subsidies really attract or address specific industries, and sometimes, and that's very interesting, and also for us as NGOs to moderate the process where we kind of show these fractures in there. For example, in between car manufacturers who are really focused, have really focused on the development of diesel engines and those who haven't. Or, I mean, with the air transport sector, it's a bit simple because then it's the train and the air transport that's a bit boring. But there is sometimes some really interesting fractions, and if we can contribute to making that visible, that there are actually actors in the industry who could make a way better business and with a way more sustainable product, with way better labor or jobs, or that would be a very, very strong argument.
Okay. Just a final statement.
Just a quick point. I think people also do not know. People also do not know what what is the exact definition of a subsidy. It's not just a direct outgo, which comes under the budgetary head of subsidies. There's a whole lot of other ways where you can something is subsidized, like reduction in taxes, no taxes, tax breaks, etc., etc. So, there are. I think that's where education, awareness, getting people, consumers on board is extremely important. Yeah. They don't understand the issue.
I just would like to say one thing for the proceeding.
Okay.
If I may.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because I was just thinking because you're writing it down like one part, the bullet points for the energy and for the agriculture, and actually how I experience our debate here, we very much focus on those points which are in common. So if you in the end, I think
it's not so strict separated as it appears here on the board. That's, I think.
For instance, education awareness should be cutting across.
Yes. No, but I think most points really.
Many of those points. Yeah.
They are all multiple overlapping, and I just wrote them down because of some of the people are from different fields, and so that's the order. But yeah.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. There was a very intensive discussion. And now at the end, I would invite you to write down your insights, what you take home message in your head when you go out. And then I will turn around this chart again, and then I invite you to pin it next to the yellow paper from the yellow part you pinned before. Maybe perhaps you find an answer. Got in your questions, or the expectation were met or not? Depends on you. One sentence. One word.
What do you want from us? Something we learned new in this workshop? Or
when you go out and you think, okay, that's what I learned, that's my result, from your personal perspective, just one sentence, one word on this red card, and pin it next to the yellow one.
The yellow one from ourselves?
Yes, yourselves. Did before.
Just put it there.
Let us know what you
have written. Interesting different perspectives on subsidies. And I do realize that, you know, what is a kind of perspective in Europe would be different from what is in Africa, could be different from what is in India or developing countries. So it's
Okay. Very nice debate, thank you very much. And what I take home is that there are several entry points to address unsustainable subsidies. But what I found nice as well to find out about the similarities from these different perspectives, because usually I always talk with the energy people only about biomass and not about subsidies. So that was interesting.
That was your big point, I think.
Yeah, I mean, there were many things, but one thing that I think we'll keep in mind is that we really have to look at both sides of the picture. Is one who gets the subsidies, but there's also people who pay for them, and that is also very important when you look at the big picture. Then we get in the end to profit from a fiscal policy, not just from the outgiving side, but also from the input side. And it wasn't exactly to my question in the beginning, so it doesn't.
Okay. It's your comment. The beginning and the end. Okay.
Yeah, there are many things I learned too, but I will take it like how to use your subsidies works and how to balance the interest. A lot of new things to think about when I get some new things. Yeah.
My main insight is I'm a little bit fearing about when I discuss about new subsidies that they become as bad in the future as these other. Also how to protect good subsidies, new ones, in getting unsustainable over time. This is.
But subsidies should be fixed to 3 years or something. I wrote down 2 points. One is I gained insights into agricultural subsidies because I didn't know so much about that before. And the second is I gained some confidence that actually issues around subsidies and subsidy reform are much more similar in between highly industrialized and industrializing countries than I feared. I mean, that's also a debate that I know a little bit about, but I'm never quite confident whether the things that we discuss for, I don't know, air transport taxes in Europe, that's kind of the same issues. But I think there are similarities, so that's good. Yeah.
So, you have to speed up a little bit.
Here's 2 points. One is the define what is necessary subsidy, and the other one is monitoring and transparency.
Yeah. So what I like is like that it's I think a very relevant issue, and as we I mean, especially for my NGO, I mean, we're trying always to be as much as relevant possible for the public discourse. So given like austerity measures and the kind of opportunity that we have to raise the issue, I think is interesting. And then couple interesting ideas of the time-bound subsidies, the setting a system to monitor when they turn unsustainable and convince recipients of the benefit they may have. In changing the system, I think were a couple of interesting ideas.
Yes, my question was about how to increase the social acceptance for using fossil subsidies or unsustainable subsidies. And of course it's important information, education, public outreach, and increasing awareness. But one point that Eike mentioned I found really inspiring is to identify splits in the industry and find maybe friends in the industry who are willing to support the reduction of subsidies. So to increase this, we need to identify splits, and I'll keep that in mind.
Yeah, for me, 2 points are very positive. First, we have seen the importance of the issue, obviously, and secondly, actions are necessary. So that I think both is important.
So thank you very much for your statements from your personal perspective. now I would like to ask you who is interested to be our representative. We have about 20 tables down there in the foyer, and we need 2 or 4 representatives going to a table, and then 6 people will come, and then during, I think, 20 minutes, you will talk about the topics you have learned here during the workshop,